My parents migrated to Israel in 1953. I was born in 1968. So Israel was quite young those years. So a lot of their heritage from Morocco, the way of living, which is very different than what we have today, was very basic, was very down to earth. So some people that used to tend flocks of sheep still did that. And people that used to grow vegetables or wheat or any other type of vegetation still did that. So a lot of the old way of living, was still existed, even when I was younger. So in my childhood, I remember I grew up in Tzfat. It's a city in the Galil, and I still remember, a neighbor still had a flocks of sheep, and he was making cheese. So in my childhood, I remember still going with them, herding their sheep or their cows, or riding horses in the wild. Nothing. It was still like very natural. Everything was very, very, very natural and simple. And people still used to share. If they made cheese, they brought you cheese, and if you had chicken, they brought you chicken, and if you grew vegetable, they brought exchange. It was still like the old-fashioned way marketplace, where they didn't exchange money, but they exchange products. My grandparents at the time were very old, and my grandmother, in the Moroccan tradition, the elderly had a lot of respect, and being observant Jews, that respect gave them almost like a spiritual ability. So my grandmother used to, a lot of people used to come to her, if they didn't feel very well or they couldn't have children. So a lot of people came to get a blessing from her. So one of the greatest story I remember is that many years later, when she was very, very old, she passed away a few years ago, and she was 103. And when she was like in her somewhere around her 90s, I remember this a relative from the family came over, and she brought with her one of the cousins, one of the family friends that was in his maybe 20s or 30s, and she was asking my grandmother if she knows him, and she goes, "Of course I know him, and I have something for him." It's almost like I have, and she had a bottle of wine, like a small bottle of wine that she saved, and she says, "This is for you. And you should have come to me." And she said to him, "You should have come to me a long time ago, because I know why you're here." They couldn't have, he was married for a few years and they couldn't have children. And, really after that meeting and after, having that bottle of wine, his wife really got pregnant, and they had children. And they could have, so this is one of the stories that I personally experienced, and to me it was mesmerizing, that she had this ability of of really looking into somebody's heart and know what they're missing and be able to help in her own way. So other than that, Tzfat is I don't know if you've ever been to Tzfat, but Tzfat is a very magical place. especially the old city. The history of Tzfat goes back to the time of the Bible, the time of the Torah, where it used to be a town of the Jewish priests, of Kohanim, and over the years, it became a major spiritual magnet. You know, in the Middle Ages, like in the 15th century, even in the 10th century, became like a spiritual center. Ari, one of the greatest spiritual leader of Jewish history, was Rabbi Yitzhak Luria, which was named Ahari Kadosh, which means the Holy Lion, and he basically established the spiritual structure of the universe. And so, to me, visiting Tzfat is part of my it's part of my everything, my essence, really, who I am, and even today, guiding me in a lot of my spirituality. I connect to a lot of the greatest mind of the spiritual world of Jewish mysticism of that time, and they still teach me to this day.
Can you describe what that looks like?
What Tzfat look like?
Yeah, or what it looked like at the time when you grew up.
So Tzfat, I actually have a photo. I'll share with you later. I have to look for it, but I have a photo. But what it looked like is there were very few paved roads. Not all roads were paved at that time. There were still a lot of old structures. When I say old, I mean they were probably a few centuries old, that people still lived in this old structure. They were like stone houses, stone building. Literally, some of them were stone and mud, not even concrete. And over the years, people took these structures and they rebuilt them. They actually rebuilt the exact same thing, but just to use like concrete and cement, to make this structure more weather resistant and more structurally sound. So there are a lot of fruit trees, like wild fruit trees, growing everywhere. The stores were small and very personal. The stores were not like what you see today. Even in Sfat, some of the areas were preserved, and you can still have that feeling when you walk the street of the old city. But some of them, were redeveloped, and part of it really actually took a little bit of the charm of the old Tzfat. But you can still feel there's definitely over the years, a lot of the history preserving society in Israel really took control of all the old places in the country, and especially in Tzfat, and help owners preserve the old feel of Tzfat. So that's pretty much it. I mean, when I was growing up, Tzfat, I guess that puts me from 48 to 68. It's 20 years. So quite a bit changed, but you can still as a child, I still remember there were a lot of areas where you could still pick apples or grapes or blackberries. just walk in the neighborhood and climb on a tree and just be able to pick apples or grapes, or because it was just growing everywhere. There was still a horse and carriage. I remember there were two people that were still operating a horse and carriage, and we used to sneak up on them. You know, one of the biggest thing was to sneak up on and catch a ride, and they used to get very mad. There was still a guy who was still selling gasoline and kerosene with a donkey and in a big container where he carried the gas, and he used to sell. He used to ring a bell, you know, and we knew that, especially in winter time, he brought it to your door. So at that time, the heating system were kerosene, and he used to sell kerosene. It was actually a very fun childhood. You know, we experienced the outside. We experienced the old, and we got to see how the slowly things are changing. But Tzfat still has its charm, its old charm.
What was your relationship like with your grandma?
So with my grandmother,
Yeah.
so with my grandmother, um, she didn't speak she didn't speak Hebrew very well. It was kind of broken Hebrew. She still spoke like Moroccan, which is an Arabic dialect. Um, and But I could understand. Even today, I can understand a little bit of Arabic, especially Moroccan, and um, it was the relationship was very respectable. In other words, she was the elder. You know, I always look at her as so it was more visiting and see if she needs anything, if she needs any help um, with anything. So it was more of that type of a relationship. To her, it was everything about food and making sure you're fed well, and so every visit was obviously involved food. You know, it was a big thing that when you come to visit, she always offered food, and so just being with her and then spending time with her, and you know, listening to the stories, experiences that she had that day, trying to understand because it was mixed Hebrew and Arabic, and of course, you know, getting a blessing for whatever uh, stage in my life I was as a child. So it was all about you know, being successful in school, uh, and when I was in the army, so you know, so I will be safe and come back home safe. Um, that kind of a relationship. It was more, uh, yeah.
And what did your parents do?
So my mother was a stay-home mom because we were 8 brothers and sisters. So she had, her plate was full, and my father was a project manager at a big construction company at that time in Israel, and he was there for almost, I would say, maybe 40 years. He worked for the company until his retirement.
And can you tell me maybe one story from the army? Like your first day or your last day?
So there's a lot of stories, but one of the stories that let's see. So there was one story where um, So I'll tell the story. In my time, I enlisted to the army in 1986. And in 1987 was the first uprising of the Arabs, the Arab uprising in Israel, and called the Intifada. So, so after finishing basic training in an Israeli unit, I was a paratrooper. We were assigned, you know, to Gaza at that time, to Yunis, really more Yunis, which is a neighboring to Gaza. And one of the things that I remember that really affected me is that there was a feeling that you know, somebody's trying to steal our country from us. Like, we learned the history, and we learned that, you know, Israel actually, you know, at that time still was very young, and the uprising was like the first time where you felt like threatened, even as an Israeli, you know, you felt threatened. And when we were in Khan Yunis, you know, a town in the Gaza Strip, I remember we were walking the street, and I remember these kids, these little children, they must have been maybe just 2 or 3 years old. And when they saw us walking, they picked up a stone, they picked up rocks, and they threw on us. And I remember thinking, how can a 2, 3-year-old learn at this young age to pick up a rock, recognize us? They almost recognize us as an enemy, or as something. And I was, in my mind, I thought, how can he know that? Or in this young age, how can he know to pick a rock, to recognize an Israeli soldier at that age? And I remember when he tried to throw the rock on me, he fell, and I went to help him. And then I gave him a candy. It was like really, to me, it was this was one of the experiences. But that was really in the beginning. That was in a very, very beginning. And of course, there's always a sad memory of losing friends towards the end in the army. But that was the you know, another another memory, like losing friends, losing young friends that, you know, a lot of the time you thought were was really for no reason, for no apparent reason. Whether it's a conflict or over land, or conflict over history or religion, it was just when you lose them, you feel like there was no reason for it. Like, it could have been avoided if the two sides really, I think more their side than our side, was willing to really make an effort to make a change.